John was driving alone in the dark. The night was pitch black, and he was on an isolated road, with only the dim headlights of his car piercing through the inky darkness. He was exhausted, having driven for hours to get back home after a long business trip. The road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dense, shadowy woods on either side. The monotonous hum of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of the tires on the asphalt began to lull him into a trance-like state. He shook his head, trying to stay awake. The last thing he needed was to fall asleep at the wheel. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. John slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt just inches away from the figure. Heart pounding, he peered through the windshield. It was a woman, drenched and shivering, her clothes tattered and dirty. John hesitated for a moment, then rolled down the window. "Are you all right?" he called out. The woman looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Please help me. I was in an accident. My car went off the road." John quickly got out of the car and helped the woman inside. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My name is Emily. I don't know what happened. One moment I was driving, and the next, I was in the woods." "Don't worry," John said reassuringly. "I'll get you to the nearest town. We'll call for help." As they drove, Emily told him about the accident. She had been driving home from visiting a friend when she lost control of her car on the slippery road. She had wandered through the woods for hours before finding the road again. John listened, glancing occasionally at Emily. There was something unsettling about her, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was just the shock of the accident affecting her. After driving for a while, John noticed that the road seemed different. He hadn't seen any signs or landmarks for miles. It was as if they were driving in circles. The GPS on his phone had no signal, and the radio only produced static. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, trying to mask his own growing unease. "I'm sure. We'll find the town soon." Minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of civilization. The woods seemed to close in around them, the darkness becoming almost suffocating. John felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. John cursed under his breath and tried to restart the car, but it was no use. "We're out of gas," he muttered. Emily's face turned pale. "What are we going to do?" John took a deep breath. "We'll have to walk. There's got to be a town or a house nearby. We can't stay here." They got out of the car and started walking down the road. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. John's flashlight cast eerie shadows on the trees, making them look like twisted, menacing figures. After what felt like hours, they saw a faint light in the distance. "Look," John said, relief washing over him. "There's a house. We can ask for help there." As they approached the house, John felt a sense of dread. The house was old and dilapidated, its windows dark and empty. But they had no other choice. John knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, it opened. "Hello," he called out, stepping inside. "Is anyone here?" The house was cold and musty, filled with old furniture covered in dust. Emily clung to John's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't like this place," she whispered. John nodded, feeling the same unease. "Let's just find a phone and get out of here." They searched the house, but it was empty. No phone, no signs of life. It was as if the house had been abandoned for years. Just as they were about to leave, they heard a noise from upstairs. A soft, creaking sound. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. John nodded, his heart pounding. "Stay here. I'll check it out." He climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood creaking under his weight. The noise grew louder as he reached the top. It was coming from a room at the end of the hall. John pushed the door open, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, except for an old mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cracked, and its surface was covered in dust. But as John stepped closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection, he could see Emily standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at him. But there was something wrong. Her eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. And behind her, a shadowy figure loomed, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. John spun around, but the hallway was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. But Emily was still there, her empty eyes fixed on him. "John," she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Come back downstairs." John backed away from the mirror, his mind racing. He had to get out of the house. He ran down the stairs, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as he searched the house, calling her name. Finally, he found her in the living room, standing perfectly still, her back to him. "Emily," he said, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She turned slowly, her face a mask of terror. "John, we need to leave. Now." John nodded, grabbing her hand. They ran out of the house, the cold night air hitting them like a wall. But as they reached the car, John froze. The car was gone. In its place stood the shadowy figure from the mirror, its eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, and darkness engulfed him. John awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. He was still in his car, parked on the side of the road. Emily was gone, and the night was silent once more. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a dream? But as he started the car and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And in the rearview mirror, he could see the faint outline of the shadowy figure, always just behind him, waiting. And John knew, deep down, that he would never escape. The road stretched endlessly before him, a never-ending nightmare from which there was no waking. It was a cold, rainy night as Mark drove down the lonely highway. He had been on the road for hours, eager to reach his destination before the storm grew worse. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and visibility was poor. Mark squinted, trying to make out the lines on the road. His phone buzzed, but when he glanced at it, he saw the dreaded "no service" message. He sighed and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The radio was no help either. All he could get was static. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, soaked to the bone, with her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Mark hesitated for a moment. Picking up strangers was something he had always been cautious about, but the weather was terrible, and she looked desperate. He pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I was in an accident. My car's in the ditch back there." "Get in," Mark said, unlocking the door. She climbed in, shivering and clutching her arms to keep warm. "I'm Mark. What's your name?" "Lisa," she replied, teeth chattering. "Thank you so much for stopping." "No problem," Mark said, pulling back onto the road. "Where are you headed?" "Just to the next town. I need to call for a tow truck and get a hotel for the night." Mark nodded. "All right, I'll get you there." They drove in silence for a while, the sound of the rain pounding on the roof the only thing breaking the stillness. Lisa seemed on edge, constantly glancing out the windows. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, trying to make conversation. I think someone was following me," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw headlights in my rearview mirror before I crashed. But when I got out, there was no car." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Are you sure? Maybe it was just the rain playing tricks on you. Maybe, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The road ahead was dark and winding. The rain had reduced to a drizzle, but the fog was thickening. Mark focused on driving, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving them in complete darkness. What the hell? Mark muttered, trying to restart the car, but it was no use. Great, just great. Lisa's breathing grew rapid. What's happening? I don't know, Mark admitted. It's like the car just died. He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the misty night. The fog was so thick he could barely see a few feet in front of him. He popped the hood and peered at the engine, but everything seemed fine. He was no mechanic, but there was nothing obviously wrong. Stay in the car, he told Lisa. I'll take a look around. He walked a few steps away from the car, shining the flashlight into the fog. The road was empty, eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He turned back to the car, but stopped short when he saw it. Another set of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly approaching. Mark felt a wave of relief. Maybe someone could help them. He waved his flashlight, signaling the car to stop. But as the car drew closer, something about it felt off. The lights were too dim, almost as if they were flickering. The car itself was old, much older than any vehicle he'd seen on the road in years. The car stopped a few yards away, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face that looked almost skeletal in the dim light. Need some help? The man asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. Mark hesitated. Yeah, my car broke down. Do you have a phone we can use? The man smiled, but it was more of a grimace. No phone, but I can give you a lift. Where are you headed? Mark glanced back at his car. Lisa was watching them, her eyes wide with fear. Something about the man didn't sit right with him. Thanks, but I think we'll just wait for a tow truck. The man's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. In this weather, tow truck might take hours. Best to come with me. Mark shook his head. We'll be fine. Thanks anyway. The man's expression darkened. Suit yourself, he said, and got back into his car. He turned around and drove off, the taillights vanishing into the fog. Mark returned to his car, his heart pounding. Someone's coming to help us? Lisa asked, her voice hopeful. No, Mark said, getting back in and locking the doors. I don't trust that guy. Lisa nodded, looking relieved. Me neither. They sat in silence, the fog pressing in around them. Mark tried the ignition again, but the car wouldn't start. Hours seemed to pass, and the night grew colder. Mark's eyes grew heavy, and he fought to stay awake. Just as he was about to doze off, he heard a noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. He turned his head slowly, dreading what he might see. Lisa was staring at the window, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Mark followed her gaze and saw a hand pressed against the glass, long fingers tapping slowly, methodically. Drive, Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Get us out of here. Mark turned the key, and to his shock, the car roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the hand slipping away from the window. They sped down the road, the fog thinning as they went. Mark didn't slow down until they saw the lights of a small town in the distance. He pulled into a gas station and stopped, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Lisa let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she said, her voice weak. Mark nodded, too shaken to speak. They got out of the car and went inside the gas station. The clerk looked up, surprised to see them. You folks all right? Mark nodded. Yeah, just had some car trouble. The clerk glanced out the window. In this weather? You're lucky to have made it here." Mark and Lisa exchanged a look, knowing how true those words were. They used the phone to call a tow truck, and soon they were sitting in the small waiting area, sipping hot coffee. As they waited, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something terrible. And when he looked out the window into the night, he could have sworn he saw a pair of dim, flickering headlights in the distance, watching, waiting. And he knew that somewhere out there on that lonely highway, the man with the skeletal face was still driving, still searching for his next victims.